Welcome, Inappropriate Earl listeners. Today it's very exciting. I probably have the smartest person I've ever had on this podcast because usually my guests are fellow comics, 80s metal musicians. And my excitement with this next guest is he said yes. I read a lot of positive thinking books. I always reach out to the authors. The Tony Robbinses of the world, the Jack Canfields, the Jen Sinceros, they don't even get back to me. And I'm really nervous right now because this next guest has put me under pressure of not asking him the typical questions that he receives on his new book, The Art of Impossible. Please, Inappropriate Earl fans, get your thinking caps on for this one. Mr. Steven Kotler, thank you.
It's good to be with you. That was a nice intro, though. Well, I think I probably spend way more time hanging out with 80s metal musicians and comics than I might with smart people as well.
Well, they're a fun group to hang out with, but I've never had a person on the podcast nominated for two Pulitzer Prizes. So, you're increasing the brainwave activity already of this podcast. I read your book in 3 days, and because as a comic, I'm always looking for a way to maintain the flow, if you will, while I'm on stage. And this goes in line with me not asking you the typical questions. The other night I was on stage at the Comedy Store doing an hour set in the main room, which is the #1 stage in the country. And the first 28 minutes were good, but they actually felt like 28 minutes. Mm-hmm. That makes any sense.
Yeah, totally.
And then one joke got the audience completely on board, and the remaining 32 or so minutes felt like 5 minutes. And that is what I found your book to be about, is how to get to that last 32 minutes. Because I just felt
I think that's a great description of actually what The Art of Impossible is about. I think you're actually totally correct.
Uh-oh, wow, now I feel smarter. But because as soon as and it was after I'd read your book, and I remember about minute 34 into that performance, I'm like, oh my God, this is what the guy's talking about. Where that flow, if you will, has kicked in. The dopamine has started coming into my brain in increments, and it was magical. And I guess my first question, and it might be my only question, is how do you get to that state, say in minute 7 instead of minute 28? Or is that possible?
It's a great question. Let's back up and sort of start at the beginning. I think. So I'm going to use a bunch of terms like peak performance. We'll start there. When I say peak performance, every human being is designed for peak performance. We'll talk about why in a second. But what I want people to understand right away is when I use that term, I mean nothing more or less than getting our biology to work for us rather than against us. So that's sort of where we're starting, right? And at the heart of that biology, if you're dealing with cognitive peak performance, you're not talking about athletics. We're not track and field, playing football, whatever. We're just going to stay in cognitive, mental peak performance, which comedy requires. There's really 4 categories, right? When you talk about peak performance, there's a set of skills that are filed under the heading of motivation. There's a set of skills under the heading of learning. Another set of skills under the heading of creativity. And finally, there's a set of skills under what you were just referencing, the heading of flow. So let's define flow for a second for anybody who isn't familiar with the term. Flow refers to any of those moments of rapt attention, total absorption. You get so sucked in on what you're doing, paying attention to the task at hand, everything else just seems to disappear. Your sense of self, your sense of self-consciousness, your awareness of yourself on the stage, right? As somebody up there doing an act and the minutes are passing, disappears. Time starts to pass strangely, as you pointed out. The technical term is time dilation. What that means is either time slows down, you can get a freeze frame effect. If you've ever been in a car crash, that freeze frame effect, that's time slowing down. Or much more frequently, what happens to you, it speeds up, right? You feel all the first 28 minutes and the next 32 happen like that. Or 5 hours go by in like 5 minutes. And throughout, all aspects of performance, both mental and physical, tend to go through the roof, which is why flow is formally defined as an optimal state of consciousness, one where we feel our best and we perform our best. You want to know, how do I get into flow faster and more frequently, right? How do I get there at minute 7 instead of having to wait to minute 32? Couple things that are worth pointing out before we even get there is every human being, almost all mammals for that matter, are hardwired for flow. So there are times in our lives when you absolutely have to perform at your best, right? If you're running away from a tiger, those kinds of things. And evolution has hardwired certain states of consciousness to help us perform at our best in those crisis situations. That's what flow is, right? It's the state that has been designed for peak performance for this particular reason. It's built in, right? It happens in anyone, anywhere, provided certain initial conditions are met. The question you're asking is, what are those conditions and how much can you work with them? And the short version is this: flow shows up when all of our attention is focused in the right here, the right now. Turns out there are 22 flow triggers, preconditions that lead to more flow. These are all things that, if you look under the hood and you look at the neurobiology, what's happening in the brain, they're all things that drive attention into the present moment. You mentioned a couple of them earlier. Dopamine. Some of flow's triggers produce the neurochemical dopamine. Dopamine, it's excitement, it's enjoyment. When it's in our system, we're curious, right? What happens when we're curious? You pay attention to the thing that's in front of you without having to work hard to do it. It happens automatically. That's what dopamine does for us. It drives attention to the present moment and helps it stay there. That's what all the flow triggers do. Sometimes they do it with dopamine. Sometimes they use another chemical called norepinephrine. Sometimes they do other things, but they're driving attention into the present moment. There are 22 flow triggers because flow comes in 2 varieties. And your question is tricky, and we'll get to why, but flow comes in, there's individual flow. That's me in a flow state or you in a flow state, right? Alone, by ourselves. And there are 12 known triggers for individual flow. There are probably way more. That's just what we've discovered so far. That's what just, and when I say we, I don't mean me, Steven Kotler, or even my organization, the Flow Research Collective. I mean the field of people who are studying peak performance and flow, and there's a lot of them. There's 12 individual triggers. There's 10 group triggers because there's a shared collective version of a flow state. I would guess what happened to you last night is, first, you dropped into individual flow around like minute 28. Something changed and you got a little bit of a reaction. We'll talk about what changed. You got a little bit of a reaction. The excitement built, and then the audience clicked and there was entrainment, and the audience was suddenly there with you, right? So group flow is when a whole group of people drop into a flow state together, and it comes in varieties. There's interpersonal flow. This is me and you. We're having a great conversation. We drop into flow. 5 hours go by. We don't even notice, right? Really common flow state. There's group flow, team flow. This is a 4th quarter comeback in football or basketball, right? Where like the team, when you look at it, when you're watching a football game and suddenly it looks like you're watching ballet instead of football, that's always a good indicator that it's group flow. When everybody's in the right place at the right time and the chaos sort of like becomes a dance and you're like, oh, okay, that's amazing. Chances are you're watching group flow in action. Or if you've ever been in a great brainstorming session, right, where ideas are bouncing off the wall and everybody's really contributing, that's group flow in action. Or there's the experience that you had on stage with an audience, communitas, group flow at scale with a group. So this is a rock concert or a political rally or comedy, right, where you merge with the audience and everybody sort of like one becomes one together sort of thing. It's communitas, group flow at scale. So let's talk about individual flow. Of the triggers that work for individual flow, and okay, me back up and tell you one other thing before we talk about the triggers. This is a long answer. You were right. This could take the whole hour, but it's a good question. So I'm going to try to answer it. All right. There's one other thing I got to tell you about flow, which is there was an old idea about peak performance that it sort of worked like a light switch. You're in the zone. You're out of the zone, right? You can turn it on or off. And it turns out that's not how it works at all. Flow is a 4-stage cycle. And you have to move through each stage to rekindle flow. So every now and again, true story, for years, when I was first doing this research and talking about it in public, invariably somebody would come up to me, especially when I was working in funkier artsier, like communities I came out of. I'm an old school punk rocker. I come out of art communities and things like that. So when I'm closer to home, there was always somebody in the audience who'd come up to me afterwards like, dude, you got to study me. I'm in flow all the time. And for years, I didn't know, like, I didn't know what to do in that particular moment. And finally, after like 5 years of this, I was like, you know what, I'm just going to start telling people the truth, which is, oh, that's interesting. You know, we have a word for that. We call that schizophrenia. Sometimes we call it manic, mania, but often we call it schizophrenia. And that's the truth. You can't be in flow all the time. If there is such a thing as enlightenment or whatever might be called enlightenment, it's not permanent flow, because flow is a 4-stage cycle. And while one stage is the flow state itself, the other 3 are very different. And so one of the simple answers to your question is, and I'll talk about what the stages are in a second, is you want to know how to move through the cycle more quickly. That's sort of one of the questions you're asking, right? And flow starts with a struggle phase. So this is a loading phase. This is where you're loading the brain with information. This is all the days before last night where you were working out bits of your routine, right? Bits of your set, and everything was bombing, right? The bits you had were new, they're like, that's struggle, right? It's just not gonna work, and you're just gonna fall in your face a lot. And then it's gonna start, clicking together. What happens in struggle and how you move through struggle more quickly is interesting. Couple things that are important. One, frustration is built into the process, literally. So that feeling of frustration that we often get along the way when we're in struggle, we're trying to learn something, trying to perfect something, trying to get better at it, and the anger that comes with it, and if you're me, the shame, the beating up on yourself, all that crap, turns out it's actually totally unnecessary. Frustration is a sign that you're moving in the right direction. It's not a sign you're moving in the wrong direction. The reason is you have, I'm going to use a big word, working memory, right? This is all the shit you can think about at any one time. It's all the stuff you can hold on to at once. Our working memory is really limited. We can, at the outside, we can remember roughly 7 to 9 digits, like single digits. Why phone numbers used to be 7 digits long. We've got 7 slots in our working memory for digits. But if we're trying to remember something harder, like concepts or how a comedy routine fits together and where the beats are and like all that stuff, concepts, most of us tap out after 4. So if you're trying to learn something and I tell you there are 4 things wrong that you're trying to fix at once, you're overloaded. You're now, like, it's too much information. You're now frustrated. Or when you're learning new skills and you've learned 4 concepts, once you're past there, I'm not saying you can't keep going, but frustration is going to start to build because you've used up all the freaking RAM in your brain. What the research shows is if you want to maximize learning, what you want to do is take yourself up to this crazy edge of frustration and then take your mind off the problem. This is the second stage of the flow cycle. First stage is struggle. Second stage is release. Release is, now we're going to come back to what you did in a high contact situation for release, but release for most people, it's literally like for me, I'm writing all morning, right? I'm trying to get sentences to work and paragraphs to work. And, I'm a writer. Most times they don't work, right? Like the only time a book ever works is at the moment that I send it to my editor and say, okay, now it's freaking done, and take it and publish it, whatever. Right? Like that's the only moment that I'm like, okay, this is solid. Everything else is like, oh, this was great yesterday, but today I realize I failed and let me fix it. That's the process of writing. I can work 3 or 4 hours on 2 paragraphs, get nowhere. Then you have to take your mind off the problem. What has to happen is your brain has to pass it from conscious thought to the subconscious So your subconscious, which is much faster, much more powerful, and a much better pattern recognition system, can process the information for you. And it happens during release. Low-grade physical activity works best here. So long walks. I go for long walks. I go for a writing session. I write for 3 or 4 hours. Take my dog for a hike in the hills behind my house for 40 minutes. Albert Einstein famously used to sail a boat into the middle of Lake Geneva and stare up at the clouds. There was research done by a screenwriter, Lee Slodoff, who was really interested in this problem. And he found that building model airplanes were actually one of the best sort of low-grade physical activity. You just basically want something that's going to keep your body a little bit busy and your mind a little bit busy, but not tire you out. Yoga, restorative yoga works well here. You can exercise, but if you exercise to exhaustion, you're going to take too much energy out of your system to get into flow. So low-grade exercise will work, et cetera, et cetera. Then once you can do that with proper application of flow triggers, and we're going to come back to what triggers we're talking about. Next stage of the cycle is flow, big high, everything comes together. On the back end of a flow state, there's a recovery phase. So if you performed last night and you went out and you partied afterwards, you didn't get much sleep, you're not recovered. You're going to have a really shitty time getting into flow tonight if you need to perform again. Because flow is a high energy state, it burns a lot of calories. You need certain things to replenish it, and you need good sleep, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a recovery phase on the back end of flow. And it's especially crucial because flow, to reboot the flow cycle, you actually have to go into struggle. You go from recovery back into struggle and then move through the cycle again. And if you're not getting any sleep and you're not doing the things you need to do in recovery, you can't get the energy you need for struggle. And now I've given you the big outline of the whole flow cycle. Let's shrink it and let's talk about what the hell happened to you last night and just in terms of the flow cycle. And then we'll come back to the triggers and how to amplify it. Yeah, this could take a while, but tell me if it's not useful. Like if I've lost you or none of this is useful. Okay. Because it's a cool question. And it's funny because I've over the years, I've done I like comedy and I've spent a bunch of time around comics over the years, and I've been really interested in doing flow research with comics, though I haven't quite figured out how to do it yet. But no, Duncan Trussell and I were talking about this a couple of years ago, and we never got it together to figure out how to do it. But I'm still like, if you want to get me a group of comics who want to do flow research, I'll figure out a way to do it. Like we can do this offline, but I'm in. Because I think it's a cool art form, and I think it opens some interesting avenues into studies on flow and creativity. So oftentimes in struggle, one of the hardest things people do is, because they expect flow, they want it to feel flowy. They're looking for that flowy, that even rhythm. And it turns out that even if struggle takes place only in 10 seconds, you have to trigger. Flow is an adaptive stress response. It's a low grade. It's similar to the fight or flight response. So there's got to be a moment of, and I'm sure this happened to you last night, there's a moment of, oh, fuck, this isn't going right. I got to lean in. I got to get aggressive. I got to step into this, right? What happens then is the body generates a little bit of testosterone, men and women, a little bit of testosterone, a little bit of norepinephrine, which is the brain's version of adrenaline. And it drives focus and it gets you ready for the fight, right? It probably got you ready to lean into a joke that you needed to really land to bring the audience back to you. So one thing to be aware of is, and this is an issue. I don't know if I can do it in comedy, but I'll give it to you in both writing and action sports. So we'll start in action sports. So really, really, really most common mountain biking injury is a broken collarbone. You get pitched over your handlebars and you land on your shoulder and you break a collarbone. Arguably the most common cause of the most common mountain bike injury is people go out for a bike ride, mountain biking, and they want it to be flowy. And they think that in their memory of flow is that it means it's a flowy even, and that's not. Mountain biking is a violent, aggressive sport. And if you go out looking for flowy, you're going to get bucked over your handlebars because your weight's going to get shifted in the wrong place because you're trying to control the bike instead of going with the aggression of the sport. You actually have to lean into the violence of the sport. It's on the other side of that aggression that you will get to flow, but you can't do it without that. So you can't, in a comedy, in a writing situation, this will often be, so I'm going along and I'm writing. I don't know if this works on stage, but I'm sure it works when you're writing material. I'm going along and I'm writing, and like, I've got a paragraph that's just not working. And it's 4 o'clock in the morning, 5 o'clock in the morning, and I can write till 8 o'clock. And, you know, I have to stop and be like, you know what, if it fucking takes me the next 3 hours to write one sentence, great. I've written one sentence. I don't care. Like, stop everything. Forget about it. This is just about one sentence. In fact, start with 2 words and I build from there. Right. And I'm like, okay, we got one sentence. It could take me an hour and then I'll get a second. And I have to do that to give myself the permission to like get aggressive and sort of attack the problem one sentence at a time and not care about, oh my God, I've got a book. I got a deadline. I got a family to feed. Like any of that other stuff, it's got to go away because I have to get aggressive and attack the thing. That's, I think, useful to know in moving from one situation to the other. The attack mode is useful for what it does internally in terms of focusing our attention. And one of the cool things about norepinephrine, and this is something that probably happened to you last night. So comedy, any creative art, is about pattern recognition. Right? If it's writing, I'm recognizing patterns in the language. If it's comedy, the language is sort of predetermined. You figured out the joke. You're making minute variations in the joke in real time in relationship to the feedback you're getting from the audience. It's pattern recognition. You're taking, this is my material. This is where the audience is at. This is how I'm going to deliver my material to really connect to the audience. Or do I have to shift, find a new joke, or, you know, blah, blah, blah. The same thing happens if you're talking about playing music or delivering theater, you know, theater lines or whatever. All this making sense?
Oh yeah. I mean, not to, I don't want to interrupt you at all.
No, just interrupt me at will. I'll talk fucking forever. Haven't you figured that out by now?
No, I love it. What happened about the 28-minute mark, long story short.
Yeah, tell me.
There was a very famous Disney actor in the crowd. And I think he had invited 3 girls to the show. Let's just say the 3 girls did not know about the other. So their table was right in front and he was being disruptive. And then the hotter of the 3 girls was amping up her anger at him. And I think the line that got the crowd and made that final 32 minutes seem like 5 was, I said, hey buddy, can you be quiet? I know you're paying by the hour, so let me get this wrapped up. And the crowd just blew up and it was sold out. And I knew at that point I could say anything. And I think that was the button of dopamine that was released, was like, I'm in. And
so let me add a couple, 2 things. So that's classic example of flow's most important trigger. Now we're back to triggers in a sense. What's flow's most important trigger? It's known as the challenge skills balance, right? The idea here is flow follows focus. We may pay the most attention to the task at hand when the challenge slightly exceeds our skill set, when we got to stretch but not snap, right? When you're pushing yourself to the edge of your skills, when you have to stop your routine, react in real time to a disruptive dude pushing you to the edge of the challenge skill spot. You have to take a little bit of a risk. When you take a little bit of a risk, you get dopamine. When you push to the edge of the challenge skill spot, you get dopamine. And there is novelty, probably a line you've never delivered before.
Never.
First time, right? So that was novelty. That gives you more dopamine. That's what sort of drives you. I would also tell you that if the dude was disruptive in the front row with 3 attractive women, other people were noticing, right? So the tension in the room is higher a little bit. So when you finally actually tell the dude to settle down and shut up, everybody else calms down a little bit. They drop into their challenge skills sweet spot. They came to see comedy. Now they've got anxiety. because the dude's disruptive. By taking charge of the situation, you calm people down. That drop in norepinephrine, that drop in anxiety can help drop a crowd into the challenge skill sweet spot.
Well, I was very scared to do the line, because a line like that could alienate me against the women in the room. I didn't know who this gentleman was until after, but I could tell he was someone, because there was a buzz in the room of, oh my God, this dude's here. I don't watch Disney Channel, but so it was, I guess, going out of my comfort zone, because I'm usually not an aggressive comic in terms of picking on people, but I just felt I had enough fear in me, but enough is enough with this guy, where I took the leap. So, which I'm glad I did.
That fear is, it's always useful. There's always elements in performance, sort of in everything, where, it's that 1 second gap of, I got to jump into the unknown. And that, in a sense, is what you're like, you want to get there in minute 7.
Yes.
This is an answer. So the answer is that how you get there is you want to up the neurochemistry. So you can use creativity. You made up a joke. Creativity, when 2 ideas link together, you get a little more dopamine. You can use novelty. You made up a joke, right? You can put that earlier in your act. Where I've seen this go wrong, I'll give you a really great example. I don't do any comedy. I do a ton of public speaking, and I have forever. Right. And believe it or not, before I did public speaking, I was a magician. As you know, you read Art of Impossible, right? So from the age 11 to almost by the time I went to college, I did magic. I did birthday parties and bar mitzvahs, and worked in restaurants doing stuff. And so I've spent on and off most of my life on stage since I was 11, and playing with crowds and things along those lines. The danger, and you see this in public speaking a lot, is my job. This is why I told you, ask me different questions. Part of my job as whatever it is to basically get on stage and say the same thing for 10 years, right? If you want to be good at sharing ideas with the world, if you care about the idea, you got to say the same thing over and over and over and over for decades, with very minor variations in themes, right? So a lot of it is a lot like stand-up comedy, in that the material's locked. You're improvising on very small sections to find your audience and connect with them. What happens to people who get too giddy with flow is they'll start improvising really early. They go off script. They leave the material because they like the high. Yes. And one of the things that you have to know, so comes out of this, we learned this the hard way in education. So in education, there's a really weird thing where 90% of the time the teacher's in flow, the students aren't in flow. And the reason is, when you're in flow as a teacher, you're sort of at the edge of your knowledge base. You're talking about the cool new stuff that you're into, and you're learning, and you're all excited because there's dopamine, there's novelty, and there's creativity. But your students who don't know any of this shit, and they're just trying to get their feet wet, are totally freaking lost. They're not engaged, and you've lost the room completely. So that happens. I don't know if it happens in comedy. And I guess that depends on your improv skills, but you see it a lot in public speaking, where people they'll start to get fame, they'll start to get known, and they'll get to a certain point where they start believing their press. They start thinking that it's them, it's not the material. And I don't need to practice. I don't need to rehearse. I can just freestyle on stage because I'm the show. And you see a lot of careers go away that way. And it's the lure of flow that is luring people in. So you can get there faster, but you have to make sure you're bringing the audience along with you.
Because it's funny, the night before that set, I had the complete opposite experience, where I was in the smaller room. I don't want to get this too comedy focused, but and it's a very dark room. The ceilings are low. The energy is really locked into that room. But when it's not going great, it can be dreadful in that room. And every comic that night, including some very big names, were bombing. And I got up there, and that's usually my specialty, is taming a bad room for whatever reason. I think it's because I'm 53 and I'm wearing leather pants and a rat t-shirt. And the crowd just laughs at me before I say anything. But that 15 minutes in that room that night felt like 4 hours. I'm breaking out my greatest hits that usually work, little zingers that usually work, and the crowd just was staring at me like I was on fire. And it was like the opposite of flow, whereas none of my old tricks were working. And so it was just weird to experience that the next night, of where flow was completely working for me. I mean, what do you do, I guess, when, and I guess you're right, maybe that frustration from the first night led to the greatness of the second night.
So there is that, you know what I mean? And there are, I mean, look, flow requires, there's a lot of external variables, you know what I mean? We could talk about like physiology. I can give you a bunch of technical terms, but like, if you haven't slept right, if you haven't eaten right, if you have, like, there's a lot of physical stuff. There's, and if you're in a really tricky situation, because you need the room to come along with you. So there's a bunch of research and no real, I don't say information like knowledge, but there's a bunch of like environmental flow, office design and flow. How do you build a high flow office and all that stuff? And is the same going to be true for a comedy space, a theater? Like, of course, you know what I mean? Good rooms and bad rooms. And I got to believe there's some algorithm that we can't, like, you need this many happy people in this many spots. You know what I mean? Like, there's a way we could try to fucking analyze. I don't think we're gonna get anywhere, but like, you know what I mean? So like, there's some rooms I think you're just gonna bomb, and there are just some days where you're just not gonna have the energy for, you know, whatever reason. And some of it is, so one of the things I always tell people, for example, during recovery is, part of recovery isn't just like getting enough sleep, getting enough food, that sort of stuff. We have every situation you're in, every time you're in facing any issue, right? It could be a challenge that you're going to rise to. It could be a problem that's going to defeat you, either or. But when you come into that situation, your brain makes an energy assessment. It says, how much energy do you need to face this issue? And it bases that on a bunch of stuff, where your sleep level is, where your, you know, energy level, how much you've eaten, your nutrition, but also social support. So if you aren't, like, if your relationships suck, there's a emotional in the moment cause, because your brain runs a danger assessment. Like, you're on stage, right? You're on stage, comedy, bombing, and you want to like do something risky, right? Should you or should you not tell that joke last night? Right? That's the question. So when your brain was making up the decision of should I or should not do this, one of the things it's asking is, are you solo? Because if you're alone, if there's nobody in the room who's got your back, or there's no people who love you to pick you up should you fall, this is a really big problem. I need to produce a lot of energy, and maybe you shouldn't take this risk. It's too big. But if you've got posse, if you know people love you, if you've reached out and had a good conversation that day with somebody you're close to, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, then when your brain runs that same calculation, it's calmer. Why does this matter so much? Because it's a challenge skills thing, right? How big is the challenge? How big of the challenge is, and part of the recovery process and part of the struggle process is, have you manicured your relationships? That has an impact on like in the moment performance that we don't often suspect. I mean, we all know it in like work environments, right? You get in a fight with your wife or your daughter or your brother, and then you try to go to work later that day and you can't focus and you're exhausted, and you, like, we see the penalty then, but there's penalties in crisis situations as well for those same kind of mistakes.
Well, you talk about a lot about grit in the book. Like, to me, grit is like Rocky training, you know, in the meat locker. Just, you know, I'm a big Stallone guy, or you know, in Rocky 3, I'm going to use a lot of Rocky references. You know, Mr. T in the basement doing the one-arm pull-ups, just saying, "F it, this is what I got to do to beat a fictional fighter in Rocky, but
Named Rocky Balboa, right?
That to me is grit. But the grit you spoke about wasn't necessarily so barbaric.
Well, you're not wrong that that's grit. So when a psychologist defines grit, most of the time they use Angela Duckworth's really famous, great definition, the intersection of passion and perseverance, right? You're talking about the perseverance element, but the truth of the matter is if you actually spend time working and training with tons and talking to lots of top performers, peak performers, everybody will agree with that definition, but they'll also say under that perseverance category, first of all, passion, there's separate things. Perseverance is what you need when you run out of passion, right? And if you look under the hood of perseverance, there's like 6 different kinds of grit or perseverance that you need to train. They're all sort of individual skill sets, and you can go Rocky Balboa on them for brief periods of time.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like and fighters are great for this. They periodicize their training, and you can sort of do that in a sense, but it doesn't work over a lifetime. Like, how the hell are you going to sustain that? So in order to sustain what we would call grit and perseverance over a lifetime, there's 6 different things you have to train. And one of them is perseverance, right? It's punch me in the face, kick me in the teeth, whatever, I'm still coming. You cannot knock me down. And we all know how to train that one. You have to push yourself slightly harder than you did the day before for long stretches of time. And, this is everything from, I've lifted weights for a lot of years. Sometimes this means if you're doing 3 sets of 10, one of those sets becomes a set of 11. Or 12, so you can prove to yourself that you can do it. It doesn't have to be 18, but I'm just going to go 2 farther today, and maybe tomorrow I'll go, or you just go up in weight a little bit, et cetera, et cetera. In writing, it could mean I write an extra 100 words today than I did yesterday. There's ways to grit it, but that's only the first level of perseverance. There's also much more important is the ability to control your thoughts, the voice in your head. This is where tools like meditation or respiration, mindfulness, all those things sort of come into play, because they're ways of training, getting a gap in between sort of emotion and feeling, and getting a little bit more emotional regulation, a little more calm in the situation. And thought control, as you know, is absolutely key to peak performance. You're never going to win a battle against the voice in your head that way. You can't. It's designed to beat you in that. So you have to learn to work with it and learn to control with it. And it takes a long time. There's grit to train your weaknesses, right? That's a different category. We've all got weak spots in our game. And the problem is, in crisis situations, that's the weak link. That's where shit's going to go wrong. So you got to train your weaknesses. And there's like 3 or 4 others. The cool thing about it is they're all trainable, and they're not actually that hard to train. And obviously, as anybody, the rewards are amazing. You know what I mean? But I also tell people, like in Art of Impossible, grit falls under the category. I said in the beginning, hey, there's a bunch of skills under the motivation heading. There's extrinsic motivation. Shit, we'll work hard in the real world to get money, sex, fame. Intrinsic motivation, passion, purpose, curiosity, right? Then there's goal setting, and then there's grit, and there's 6 categories of grit. That the order that's laid out in Art of Impossible is based on, there's been really cool advances in the neuroscience of peak performance over the past 20 years. We've learned a great deal. And one of the things that we've learned is that there's an order to the process. Like there's a way evolution sort of designed us to onboard new skills. You don't have to follow the blueprint. You can hopscotch around and do it any which way you can, and you'll still get there. But it's just easier if you work with your biology, right? I said in the beginning, peak performance is nothing more than getting our biology to work for us rather than against us. There's an order. It's evolution shaped it to come on board this way. There are reasons. And if you just go in that order, it's easier. So in the book, I start with where motivation starts with this extrinsic motivation. Then we cover intrinsic, then we do goal setting, and then we get to grit. And one of the reasons is once you get those first three categories right, you start getting more flow. And if you start training a lot of grit stuff before you're getting flow, you're just going to burn out. It's freaking miserable, right? It'd be like being a comic and bombing every night, never getting better and never getting any flow. How long are you persevering, right? It's not sustainable.
Well, I think the biggest takeaway I got from your book, and I'm not going to lie, I got a little lost on some of the parts of the brain talk, but I'm not like the smartest guy in the world. Like when you were mentioning the amygdala and the frontal cortex, I was like, Jesus, can you just say the front of the brain? But that's me. Is the passion, because you pop into my head a lot. And let me finish before you go, this guy's a stalker. Like last night, I was asked, Earl, what happened to the group of friends that you started comedy with 20 years ago? And I started to think, and I thought, wow, about 90% quit. And I kind of wondered why, and they didn't have the passion for it that I do. Like I'm not into comedy for the fame or the money. I certainly realize you can get those things if you stick with it and if you have a base borderline talent level. But those other 90% of my friends, they didn't want to struggle. There's, I think, at least in comedy and maybe not big wave surfing like the great Lord Hamilton, there's I want it now and I don't want to work for it a long time. And I think with the grit, the goals, the flow state, you don't get any of that if you don't have the passion. Am I wrong in that assessment?
I don't think you're wrong, because so there are people who get lucky, right? There's people who have Brad Pitt's abs and they get cast in Thelma and Louise, right? But you still have to, like, that happens once. You know what I mean? Like I always say, the worst thing that can happen to any creative is, like, for an author, your first book is a hit. Because as a general rule, you're so young in your career, you don't actually even know how you wrote that first book.
Right.
Right. And you haven't figured out that. And then you come to your second book where you actually have to figure out how to do all that stuff. And it crushes a lot of people. I think early success is really is dangerous. Like that's a hard one to negotiate. But if we throw that aside, success is a very long haul. There's nobody, you know what I mean? I even when I was back in a journalist, I was covering, I was in Los Angeles and I was writing about, Hollywood stuff. I always said that, like, I was always interested. I didn't care who I was in the room with. I could be writing a Maxim story about a cover, like their cover girl. Nobody got on the cover of Maxim by accident. Like it's hard to get famous. It's hard to be at the top of any game. You can get lucky, but staying there actually requires skill and grit and all that. It's fucking hard. It's hard in every profession. And so without the passion, you will sooner or later, you're going to quit. Right. I always say that how I could always tell a real creative from a fake one. Creatives are I like with authors. I always want to start my next book before I publish the one I'm writing, because it's not like what happens after I put it out in the world. That's the world. Yeah, there's some PR and marketing stuff that I'm supposed to do. I have a job, right? But like what it does it tank? Is it a bestseller? Does it get nominated for I don't care. My job, I'm already on to the next project. Creatives are all about the next project because we like the high of creating. That's the joy. And if that's not the passion, right? If that's you'll never stick with this career, because the ups, and even if you get famous, you're gonna get famous for 3 weeks, and then somebody else is gonna get famous for that. You know what I mean? Like, so, and you're left with yourself after the end of those 3 weeks.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, passion. I mean, I've been rejected for more TV shows than probably every comic combined, and I'm still going. And I started getting on TV shows, and then got passed at the Comedy Store after 13 years, which most people I don't know if they admire my comedy, but they admire my ability to keep going, like just ramming through the wall. And obviously I care, but
Well, I always said, like, the people who really interested me the most, one of my longtime biggest heroes is Tom Waits.
yes,
And one of the reasons, it's because he's been cutting edge, creative and innovative, like since the 70s to now. He's had an incredibly long creative career. He's had to reinvent himself and reinvent himself and reinvent himself and reinvent a little bit. And those are the things that are really super interesting to me, is somebody, I call it long haul creativity. It's what I wrote about a little bit in Art Impossible, right? How do you sustain creativity over a career? And I don't like, you brought up 80s hair bands always interested me a lot,
yes,
because one of the things that I found super interesting, and back as a journalist, we did these stories at a magazine, like a couple of different magazines, where like in the 80s, there were a bunch of dudes who were selling out 50,000 person stadiums, who were painting houses by the 90s.
yes.
And I knew a bunch of those guys, right? And I was always like, that was what was fascinating to me, is what it's got to feel like to go from like 5 million to painting houses, like that come down. And then, but what was really interesting was the guys who, they had the painting houses, and then they went back and refound their creative career and started it again. And those are the things that are really interesting to me, is how do you go from that ultimate success, crash all the way back down, and then rebuild again? Those kinds of questions are really neat.
Well, I think, I've struck up a weird friendship with Stephen Pearcy, the singer from the band Rat. And, they were, at the top of the food chain. They got lucky. Their first album came out when MTV was just a baby network, and they put Milton Berle in their video, and they were huge. And then they had a dip, and then a little bit of a rise, and then a dip. And I asked him when he came on my podcast, like, how do you keep going? And he just said, I love it. Like, I've gotten the money, I've gotten the girls, and I still like music. And, he would put out a grunge album when, grunge was big, and maybe it didn't work, but he still did it. And then, well, he never put out a boy band album, but like he kept going. And he's still touring. And, some bands like, say a Cinderella, they had a big peak, and then the grunge hit, and then they tried to keep going, and then all four guys were like, that's it. So, I'm sure they had the passion for the music, but
yeah, but even after that's it, right? Like the question I ask is like, not so much, because there's all kinds of next. Are they still doing something creative with their time
right,
that is as rewarding? Because I don't like, this from comedy, if like your addiction is to the thing that happens when you're on stage, that's just a dopamine high. It's like a sugar high. It's a fake high. And in fact, one of the things that I think is very true for extended peak performance is you got to learn to not ride that high too long, because if you ride it too high, it's going to take all your dopamine, and it takes a while for that to replenish, and you need that to get into flow the next night.
right.
So if you get seduced in by all the like stuff that comes along with it, then you're going to actually exhaust the kind of neurochemicals you need to achieve peak performance.
Well, I think I'm, like the opposite of my favorite band, Kiss. Kiss has changed. Polka was popular. Kiss would put out a polka album. They kept their passion going, maybe for making money, not necessarily music. With whatever trend was popular, they would jump on it. So if it was keyboard rock, all of a sudden keyboards were on a Kiss album. If it was, Pink Floyd, The Wall, they came out with a concept album. And, I'm more like, this is my style of comedy. I'm dry, I'm sarcastic. I'm not going to act like Dane Cook. Not that there's anything wrong with that. I'm not going to tell jokes like Chris D'Elia. Not that there's anything wrong with that. So is there a way to kind of almost balance sticking to your roots and maybe changing with the times?
Well, this is a question I was so I was having this discussion from a different angle with some writer friends a couple weeks ago, because I unearthed a short story that I remember writing from like 20 years ago, 15 years ago. And it's actually like, it's amazing. It's like a complete whole story. I was like, holy shit, I should publish this. Like, this is solid. But what was really wild about it was you could see my writing style from today. You could see a lot more elements than I would have ever thought present. And I was like, oh, wow. Like, this is great. I do a specific thing that I'm known for and people appreciate, and that's cool. But it's also this weird prison of creativity where, like, as far in my mind as I thought, as I've gone from the writer I was to today, no, it's actually not that. It's a much more kind of limited, kind of circle than I thought I was in. And I've been thinking, I don't know what the answer is. Like, the answer is obviously yes, you can continue to be creative that way for a very long time. But I'm interested in the idea that, like, one style sort of becomes not just a prison for your creativity, but like it's an invisible thing, right? Whatever your style is, it formed with you, and like, you can tinker with it, you can Tiger Woods it and try to reinvent your swing halfway through. But because I think I've tried to reinvent I've written 14 books. I try to reinvent like how I write the book and how I sound and how I talk and how I approach it. Every book is different from the next because I like the challenge. But it turns out they've got a similar voice. I can't break out of that thing I do, whatever it, you know what I mean? And I'm sure the same is true. I don't know where this is going, but I just find it fascinating that, like, it's hard to get past your style. So no, I think you have to just innovate on top of it.
Well, no, I don't know where it was going either. But I just, I guess it maybe goes back to, Kiss stays in the state of flow by changing styles every album. And then you take a band like, say, Motorhead, that every Motorhead album sounds the same. Like, you can't tell the first album is any different than the last album.
Yeah, no, so Malcolm Gladwell's a writer. Like, I always said, the most interesting thing to me about Malcolm Gladwell is almost every sentence is the same for his whole damn career. Like, it's freaky. There's another writer, there's an adventure writer, John Krakauer, wrote Into Thin Air. Like, he's been the same, where you look at, like, he's written tons of books. They're all great, but it's the same style from like the first book to now. And I don't even know how they do it. Like, it makes I look at it like, I don't know how you pull that off at all. Or like, there was I'll give you another writing example on this one. The guy who broke the global warming story, the climate change story, it was really one guy who kept writing. He's a Boston Globe reporter, and he wrote the same story basically once every 2 weeks for almost a decade before people started paying attention, before scientists even started paying attention and things like that. And I remember talking to him about it, and I remember thinking to myself, as a flow junkie, as a writer, I don't know how the fuck you did that. Like, that's like a crazy magic trick to me. Writing the same story for a decade, you know what I mean? Like, I couldn't figure it out. But you're right. There are Kiss pulled it off in their way. Neil Young with the Shocking Pinks, like, he's the guy who's really, like, he definitely went all over the place as well in those middle years.
Oh, sure. I mean, I guess I'm just a fan of persistence and resilience. Like, the hottest TV show on right now is Cobra Kai, the series about the Karate Kid. And you look at most of the actors in Cobra Kai, or the original actors from the 3 Karate Kid movies. These guys and girls couldn't get work the last 20 years, 25 years. And that yet some writer, said, guys, I mean, I don't know if he said this or she, this can work in 2020. We can basically reintroduce the Karate Kid to the Gen Z millennial crowd. And, it started off as just a small YouTube show that, didn't get a lot of traction. Now it's the #1 show on Netflix. So it took someone getting in that state of flow to put that idea out there into the world. And, like,
I also think there's one of the cool things about now is there's a lot more places to be an actor, to be a comic, to be a writer. I mean, it may be harder to get to like certain pinnacles that you could before, but there's what's a lot, creativity was controlled top down for all, you're my age, right? For,
Yes.
I grew up in Cleveland, right? When I grew up, there was 3 networks and that was it. We didn't get cable. We didn't get there was punk rock zines and 3 networks of television. And that was you know what I mean? And some magazines that were controlled by Condé Nast. And there were, 10 publications and none of them were speaking to, people like me. So, we went from that, and we're the comedy that you could do and have a long career was really slender boxes to now huge, right? That much bigger boxes. So I think there's greater opportunities for longevity and things like that, which are really neat. I think we'll see greater and greater creative careers that way.
Well, I think what's exciting to me and for authors like you and fellow comics, Duncan, is that, like you say, there's so many more. When I was growing up, the only comedy I ever saw was on The Tonight Show. And if you weren't one of those 20 comics that Johnny Carson liked, you were kind of effed in terms of making it. Now you have, Netflix, HBO, Amazon, Hulu, Comedy Central, YouTube, a lot of comics. And I see some self-help authors are putting their videos or comedy on YouTube for free and just saying, here it is, watch it, with no manager or agent or whatnot. And so I think it's an awesome time to be a creative in any field.
I agree with you. And I think the other half of the equation where this conversation started is because we're gaining an understanding of sort of peak performance, how it works in our bodies, how we can get more of it basically over time. Quality is going up, and I think it's less difficult to be a creative, right? The hardest part for me of being a creative, especially when I was coming up before I understood peak performance, was the emotional ups and downs, being locked out of flow, not, for long stretches of time, things like that, where I, couldn't perform at my best and whatever. And now I think, not only do we have more channels for expression, but we have more control over the tools of performance than we've ever had.
Well, I also think it's what I loved about your book, The Art of Impossible. Please, guys, I don't get a cut of the profits here. Please buy it. It is a very quick read. And, I went to a Tony Robbins seminar once. He had me break the board and walk on the fire and all that stuff. But there was just something off about the delivery that didn't work for me. So your style works for me because it's a little more blunt. It's a little more, here's the facts.
Yeah, Tony and I seem to do different. Tony seems to be doing self-help. I'm not quite sure what I've never been really comfortable with self-help. I'm interested in the science, how this is how humans work. This is how we get them to work better. And maybe that's what Tony's doing. And it just seems very different, but I'm like you, I want it practical. I don't, too much pageantry doesn't work for me.
Yeah, and that's not talking bad about Mr. Robbins.
No, yeah, I mean, I've met him. He's an interesting dude, and he's my partner, Peter Diamand, he's one of his closest friends. So I have nothing, and he clearly has made a dent in tons of people's lives. But I'm like you, it didn't click with me. I have to come at these things in a different way.
Yeah, and I'm sure he would work for, obviously has worked for hundreds of thousands of people, but I'm going to try and, not that you need my help, Steven.
No, I appreciate it. All I need all the help I can get, I think.
Well, first of all, I owe you thank you just for doing this podcast, because like I said, most people say no.
The other thing is, I don't get the other thing is I always thought, to me, I just wanted to smuggle flow and peak performance sort of into the heart of, not the mainstream, but just the world. Cause these are the more interesting conversations to me. Cause I like comedy a lot. You know what I mean? It's contributed a great deal to my life overall. So I get to talk to comics, and they're going to be better at comedy as a result. Cool. Like that, like, okay, that's a good bargain for me. I'll take that trade.
Oh no, I mean your lessons on stacking little dopamine hits has helped me already, and like.
Well, so that was your answer to like questions. How do you get there at minute 7, right? That's what I would start talking about, is stacking dopamine, like maybe giving yourself a couple spots to take a chance at minute 3 and another one at minute 6, right? Just, this is an improv line. I've got those when I give speeches, I like humor. So I've got like 3 or 4 or 5, spots, and I've got a rotating sort of carousel of jokes that drop in depending on like who my audience is and what's appropriate, what I could actually get away with saying on stage, and those kinds of questions. And when they go wrong, there's definitely less flow afterwards in the speech. And when they go right, you know what I mean? They do their job. And then the time goes by better on stage. I think the most important thing for me is the days I like the best, by the way, on stage or as a writer or as an athlete, anything like that, is I like the days when I actually learn to perform at my best. I do all the things I used to need to be in flow to do, and now I can do without flow. That's usually a sign that I'm about to like level up a whole new level, right? But I'm a skier, and there's always a day as I'm leveling up as a skier where like I go out and I do all the crazy, hard, gnarly shit I did the early season in flow. And this is now, I've been practicing all those things now for a couple of months. And now I like have a day where I'm tired, maybe I'm hungover, I got nothing. And yet I pull all the same shit off that at the start of the season needed flow. And now I can do without it. And that happens in writing too. There are books I've written, some of my earlier books, where I could write that way, but only if I was in flow. And then it literally took me years to figure out how to do the same thing out of flow. And once you get there, then you get a whole huge level up.
Sure.
And so those are really interesting to me too. They feel awful, right? I don't know if you have that experience with comedy, but like my experience as an athlete or as a writer in those days, like it fucking sucks. But like I come away from the end, I'm like, wow, that was a hell of a victory. That was amazing. I don't know how you did that.
Oh, I have many nights like that, Steven. But first of all, I'd like to thank your assistant, Anne, for setting this all up. She told me you have a hard out at an hour. We are at an hour. I want to be respectful of your time. I could talk to you forever. So the book is The Art of Impossible by Steven Kotler. It's not the only book he's written. Go to stevenkotler.com. And where can they find you on Twitter, Steven?
I think it's at Steven_Kotler.
And follow him on there. And he's really a fantastic.
Yeah, that is true. By the way, I just did not quite know what my Twitter address is.
Let me look it up real fast, just so we can. I don't want to direct anyone of our fans to. Yes, it is Steven_Kotler on Twitter.
What's fun, yeah. And what's funny is you discovered, Earl, is that I'm on Twitter. I just don't know but you can reach me that way.
Well, usually when I read a book, I'll go, oh, they got to be on Twitter. And most are, and then most never get back to me. And you got back to me immediately and said, I'll do your podcast. Just don't ask me. And I can only imagine you get the same questions. And I'm sure the interviewers mean, well, how do I get into flow, Steven? What is great?
They're great. I just like that, we talked about all the same stuff, but we got to talk about it under the lens of comedy, and that's neat. I got to learn more about comedy than I knew before. So that's cool to me.
Well, I think comedy is such a flow business. I mean, when you're in it, I tell people it's a sexual high when it's going well. If that makes any sense, it's like a good golf shot. I don't know why I relate things to sex from the standpoint of the feeling, but a good golf shot is the same feeling. And comedy is a flow. When it's going well, those minutes seem like seconds. When it's not going well, they seem like hours. So, Steven, I really thank you from the bottom of my heart for doing this. And
my pleasure. Thanks for having me on. It was fun hanging out.
Oh, please
Take care.
let me know when you're in LA so I can grill you some more with 2 more questions that'll take 2 hours.
Okay, we can do that. I'm not in LA very often, but I've been getting a bunch of requests from friends to come out sooner or later, so I'll do it.
All right, Steven, thank you so much and have a great day.